For the sake of time, I will get going. I'm Meredith Stricker. I'm the Executive Director of the Soufan Center, one of the hosts for today, and we're really so pleased and honored to be welcoming you here for the conference in Doha. And I am going to introduce Colin, our MC, since he's moderating this panel. So Colin Clark is an assistant teaching professor in the Institute for Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University and a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center. So he's one of my excellent colleagues. Colin spent nearly a decade at the Rand Corporation, where he was a senior political scientist focusing on terrorism, insurgency, and criminal networks, directing studies on ISIS financing, the future of terrorism and transnational crime, and lessons learned from all insurgencies between the end of World War II and 2009. And I am going to turn it over to Colin to moderate our third panel, Foreign Terrorist Organizations, Policy Tools, Designation, and Financing.
So as Meredith mentioned, this third panel is going to focus on the financing of terrorism and ways that countries and non-governmental entities can counter the financing of terrorism. I'll start by introducing my fellow panelists, and then I will just make some brief remarks before turning it over to the real experts here. So first we have Major General Abdul Aziz Al-Ansari. He's been the chairman of the National Counter-Terrorism Committee and the director of the International Cooperation Department of the Ministry of Interior since 2014. From May 2014 to May 2015, he was the director at the Arab and International Police Communication Department in the Ministry of Interior, where he was responsible for managing and supervising police cooperation and coordination with Interpol, the GCC, and Arab countries to enhance international, regional, and domestic security. Dr. Daniel Byman is the Vice Dean and Professor in the School of Foreign Service with a concurrent appointment with the Department of Government. From 2002 to 2004, he served as a professional staff member with the 9/11 Commission and with the Joint 9/11 Inquiry Staff of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Professor Byman has also written extensively on a range of topics related to terrorism, international security, civil and ethnic conflict, and the Middle East. Dr. Matthew Levitt is the Former-Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he directs the Institute's Stein program on counterterrorism and intelligence. Previously, Levitt has served in the Senior Executive Service as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Jason Blazakis is professor at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey and a terrorism expert who devises strategies to prevent terrorists from gaining access to money and publicity. From 2008 through 2018, he served as the director of the Counterterrorism Finance and Designations Office, Bureau of Counterterrorism at the U.S. Department of State. Many of these individuals are probably familiar to you already if you follow this topic, as they're prolific in the field and are constantly publishing on these topics. So welcome to our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much for joining us today. I've been studying terrorism financing for the better part of the last 10 years, have directed some studies on the topic at Rand, including specifically on ISIS financing. More recently, I've been writing about the fact that even without the control of territory, the Islamic State is likely to be able to continue financing its organization. I had a piece just recently in Foreign Policy and then testified before the House Financial Services Committee on the same topic as well. But I'd like to basically serve here to moderate and shepherd through Q&A, and I'd like to open it up right now to our panelists. So, Major General.
First of all, to start with, I would like to really extend my thanks to the organizers, Georgetown, Qatar University, Qiyas, and Soufan Center for organizing this seminar, because, and then also I would like to extend my thanks to them for choosing the subject, because this is actually a very, very, very important subject for us. It's not only for the state of Qatar, it's for the globe. Because we've been, now I think this phenomena has really, invaded every single corner of the people's life. So therefore, it's very important for us to discuss it. Foreign fighters is the subject right now. It's been emphasized on Security Resolution 2396. Before it was 2178, and then, now it's reflected onto the United Nations Counter-Terrorism strategy, one of the 4th pillars. It's definitely now, after the defeat of Daesh and in Syria and Iraq, it's becoming now an issue of the spread of those people around the areas, around the globe, around the countries. That would definitely enforce all countries to really talk about enhancing, aviation security, airlines, airports, and to really put into system. Also, United Nations has now, through their counterterrorism office, proposed an ABI system for the travelers, a traveler targeting system, which really definitely designates all these individuals to really know before time how to really trace those travelers and their, FTFs, and to really bring them to justice or confine their movements or really restrict their acts. Of course, as I would take you, through a trip with me just to know exactly this phenomena. How did it start? It starts actually with the physical act, which is Terrorism Act, and then it switched to the financial system, hunted the financial system all over the world, and that definitely reflected in the internet. When I say internet, the financial system, all of it, affected by the internet. So therefore, hunted the cyber and hunted, they were, especially Daesh, they were very much capable of really using the recruitment through the internet. They were very much capable of really utilizing the capability. Then they switched to Bitcoins and then to Darknet. And then now they are unlimited. And whoever thinks that this is going to end, I think experts will definitely have full indication that these people are really finding now the safe haven anywhere else to really, reinvent their power and work again. So we have to be, without the joint efforts between all governments, we can never, bring these phenomena down. I will definitely here touch on the one of the issues which are affecting the counterterrorism. We're trying to really fight it, which are the domestic designation regime, which is definitely an implications from the United Nations Security Council resolution. It's a must for each country to really bring that regime into the system of the government. So therefore, we have started. Qatar has started their law in 2004, law number 3, to really define and counter terrorism. It was a full law which are really confining and mentioning everything about terrorism. As the phenomena develops and touching in everything, we were forced in 2017 to really go and revisit that one and amend that law to come with the law 2017, number 11, 2017. And that definitely has enhanced our definition on counterterrorism on that law, and then invented the domestic designation regime for the state of Qatar. And we have defined that regime on 3 aspects. The first aspect, whoever been designated by definitely the Security Council, which is under Chapter 7. Then, here we have delegate the responsibility in all our government forms and non-government forms to really follow up the list, the designation list of the Security Councils. Therefore, they have to take an immediate action against anybody being designated by that one. Until the process happens through our mission in New York, and then to Foreign Ministry, and then to Attorney General here in Qatar, to our committee, which is the Qatar National Counterterrorism Committee. From us, we will take the action, of course, to really designate him domestically. This is actually the one, system. The second system, which is the international cooperation. Any intelligence information that comes from anywhere, will have to really come to us through the Foreign Ministry, through our security, intelligence. We will have to forward it, and then Attorney General will have to bring it. We will have to do our due diligence on the issues through our financial system and through our intelligence system to make sure that this individual has conducted any illicit financial transfer or any move or any action that definitely affected our system. So therefore, in this regard, we would have to really inform our Attorney General that this individual has no account, for example, in Qatar, has no activity, therefore we cannot really designate this individual. On the other hand, of course, if we find any illicit financial transfer or have any doubt about this individual, we put a recommendation to the Attorney General to do that one. What's so exceptional about Qatar here is that we do not designate anybody except the Chapter 7, of course, this is what comes from Qatar, from the university, from the Security Council. Domestically, we have to have a judicial, decision in order for us to take action domestically on any individual here in Qatar. So therefore, if we find any illicit, we will just definitely transfer the issue to Attorney General. Attorney General will give us the instruction to circulate the whole thing, to everyone in Qatar which has a concern with the issue, to really designate individual. Of course, designation means just like the Security Council designation, we have to freeze his asset, ban him travel, and ban him from weapon embargo. This is actually the third issue is if this individual has been, forwarded with a case to the court and the court has issued a verdict of designating this individual, then we do it directly as, this individual designated. Once we designate this individual, definitely we'll forward it to our website where we publish his name with his description, with everything, for that one. Of course, the law here in Qatar has given those individuals when they are designated, except for the people who are, designated from the Security Council, whoever is designated domestically has the right to approach the court within 60 days after the designation resolution or decision to really claim, to be removed. And then, his process will take place through the court. If the court decided that this individual, is okay and he's free, then we could really then delist him from the list based on the, judicial system. This is, of course, just to take you with you through take you with me through this trip of this, of the system. And probably I will just definitely give the opportunity to my other panel to really give us more information about the other system. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank everyone for staying with us this afternoon, and particular thanks to my hosts and the Soufan group for having us today. What I'd like to talk about is going to be surprisingly optimistic for such a grim topic. When we talk about terrorism, most of what we talk about, understandably, is the threat of terrorism, the danger of terrorism. And that applies, of course, when we talk about foreign fighters. However, in many ways, the evolution of the foreign fighter threat reflects a remarkable success of counterterrorism. And if you look back at the statements of world leaders, if you look back at the statements of security officials, they're often much more grim than the later reality proved to be. And when we think about the foreign fighter story, and something I'm very interested in is its history, so much of what we think about are the people who went to Afghanistan, and then after Afghanistan later conducted some of the world's most deadly terrorist attacks, founded a range of deadly groups around the Muslim world, and otherwise proved the inspiration for groups that have killed thousands, tens of thousands of people. But subsequent post-Afghanistan struggles have been quite different. And in particular, in my opinion, after the September 11th attacks, there was a dramatic change in counterterrorism. And that has affected the threat in ways that I don't think people have realized, to the point where things like the Iraq War in 2003, which attracted a significant number of foreign fighters at the time, actually produced far less violence from foreign fighters than most people anticipated when the war began. So what I'm going to talk about is that degree of success, and I'll recall our morning panel's discussion, where it was pointed out that since September 11th, there have been no foreign fighter attacks that succeeded against the United States. It's all been homegrown violent extremism. That in Europe, the biggest problem today is not foreign fighters, but is homegrown violent extremism. And that the problem has shifted, but as I'll stress, it's really due to policies, not due to the inherent nature of the threat. But let me begin with an analytic point, which is I think the struggle in Syria is unusual in many ways. So often when we talk about what is the next Syria, what will be the next magnet for foreign fighters, I think it's important to remember what made Syria unusual. One thing that made it unusual was that the struggle against the Assad regime was widely seen as legitimate by governments around the world. President Barack Obama, prime ministers in Europe, leaders in the Muslim world all recognized that the Assad regime was slaughtering hundreds of thousands of its own people, and that resistance was entirely appropriate. Now, that's not the same as joining a terrorist group, but the overall cause had legitimacy beyond a small group of individuals or a small cause. In addition, the Islamic State itself was incredibly successful. And by establishing the caliphate, by ruling over a large territory, it had truly established what it considered to be an Islamic State. And very few groups have succeeded in remotely the same way. Even groups that have been relatively close, like the Shabab, never achieved the kind of scale of the Islamic State. And most of the others have fallen quite short. And a huge selling point of the Islamic State was that it was successful. And the fact that it's been diminished significantly due to military action is a tremendous blow. And part of, though, what made it successful was unusually there was not decisive military action against the group until it was quite strong. While in many other cases, because there's a jihadist group with ties to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, world governments are much more willing to act. But because of the illegitimacy of the Assad regime, most governments appropriately were not willing to help it. So we saw this group have a haven, ironically, because it was in a state that was the enemy of many countries around the world. Many governments didn't take the danger too seriously, and for some, not until the Paris attacks of 2015. So you had a slow counterterrorism response even at home. You had new technologies of social media that enabled connections that caught people by surprise as well. And I think something that gets underestimated because it's so obvious was the importance of Turkey as a transit route. That for several years, Turkey did not seal its border. And once Turkey made impressive efforts to do so, the threat changed dramatically. So we've seen tremendous change in a lot of these factors that made, I think, Syria unusual and hard to duplicate in the future. Not impossible, but hard. When foreign fighters go to a conflict, and here I'll speak not just of Syria, but well beyond Syria, they often cause tremendous problems for the group in question. We tend to see them as inherently dangerous, which they are, but without recognizing that there are groups that are actually quite resistant to having foreign fighters join their ranks, or groups like Jabhat al-Nusra in the past that were very careful about who they picked. Many of the foreigners, of course, were tremendously unskilled. Right? They came with very little military experience, very little combat experience, and perhaps you could use them as a suicide bomber, but even then, they were not terribly skilled. When they come in simply as foreigners, they conflict with local nationalism, that they're individuals coming in from somewhere else, often tied to causes that have a nationalist flavor. The groups themselves are suspicious of the foreigners, worrying that many are spies. So we see the groups taking rather draconian actions against many of the foreigners. Also, because the foreign fighters themselves don't recognize borders, they often expand the conflict. So we saw in Chechnya that foreign fighters were vital, if you will, to the initial invasion of Dagestan next door that led to the Russian response that eventually led to the crushing of the Chechen movement. We saw in Somalia that foreigners played an important role in expanding the conflict next door to Kenya. We saw in Syria that foreigners played a role in expanding the conflict next door as well. And that, while making the group in some ways more frightening from a counterterrorism point of view, is actually disastrous from the local group's point of view. That all of a sudden they have a whole new set of enemies, they've wasted their resources, they've expanded the battlefront, often in ways they can't sustain. And in so doing, the foreigners are often magnets for foreign intervention in a way that's quite negative for the local groups that they've attracted. What the Assad regime, I think, did quite well, I wish they hadn't, but they did it well, was they were able to discredit the opposition and say that the opposition were all a bunch of jihadist terrorists. And what you saw over time was a movement in that direction, that the Assad regime was able to polarize society successfully. Russia has done the same in Chechnya. And whenever the foreign fighters appear on the other side, the government has a propaganda weapon against them. Not surprisingly, we see in Yemen, we see in parts of Syria that some groups have become much more resistant to taking in foreign fighters. One of the biggest changes, though, in the post-9/11 period has been a change in the intelligence picture. If we were having a discussion before 9/11 about a group like on foreign fighters, the number of people in this room would probably be equal to the number of people in the world working on the problem. Right? I have no idea how many people in the world are working on the problem, but I'm going to guess in the tens of thousands, if not more. Right? It's a staggering shift in resources. And that shift in resources has paid off in the level of information gained. That there's much more knowledge about people on an individual level. There's also a huge change in that it used to be when someone went to Afghanistan in the past, it was a black hole. You didn't know where they went, you didn't know what happened to them, you lost track of them. But now intelligence collection in a war zone is much better. And often individuals are detected when they're away, and so they're anticipated for when they return. There's global cooperation. Right? So you have governments that are sharing extremely high degree of information, and sometimes it's regional, sometimes it's global. Credit goes to many of the people in this room, but it's, again, truly a remarkable shift where in the past information was jealously guarded, and even within Europe, even within the EU, information was not widely shared. Social media. The internet companies took a number of hits earlier today, and it's hard to be excited about internet companies when they have often hosted very nasty content, and when they also sell your data at the same time, so people don't particularly like to defend them. I do think it's a bit unfair in that it's unrealistic to shove this problem onto private companies that are global private companies with different jurisdictions and say, from a government point of view, the companies should do better. Right? The actual answer is the government should do better. In particular, you should have legislation in countries like the United States. You should have global agreements where the companies are forced to abide by and recognize these agreements. To me, this is more a failure on the public side than the private side. But even putting that aside, I think people have missed the tremendous role that counterterrorism plays when it comes to social media. Right? One thing we used to struggle with many years ago was simply trying to identify an individual's friends or connections. Okay, we know this person's a foreign fighter. Who do they know? Who might they be in contact with? Now if we know their Facebook profile, we know their Twitter profile, we know everything. Right? They put themselves into link analysis software. Right? This is a counterterrorism dream. They post their views. They often post their locations. For the first years of the Syrian civil war, you could track individuals in Syria because they left their location finders on. Right? I mean, there's a remarkable amount of information that people openly reveal, and huge numbers of individuals are arrested at the airport. Right? So the figures that Peter Bergen raised this morning about large numbers of individuals from the United States who were disrupted. Many were disrupted because of their social media profiles, where they tweeted out information that revealed them to law enforcement and led to arrests. Recently, of course, the terrorist groups have shifted. And the general has mentioned, for example, how they're using different internet platforms, and that's very important. But when you shift to more private encrypted communications, there are going to be huge costs. Your ability to recruit goes down dramatically. Your ability to use propaganda goes down as well. So I don't want to make this sound like everything's perfect here, but sometimes I think we always jump to the negative when on things like social media, it's been quite positive. But all that said, let me mention a few areas where I think we could do significantly better. One is this idea of community trust. What you want is a community to police itself, to look at people who might join a terrorist group the way they would look at someone who might harm a child, to look at someone who might do a grave crime. And you simply want them to call the police if they're suspicious. What I would say in the United States and in Europe is the demonization of the Muslim community by people, including the President of the United States, is incredibly negative and incredibly dangerous simply from a counterterrorism point of view. It's morally wrong, but if your goal is to fight terrorism, it's also incredibly dangerous. I would also point out the need to make sure that terrorist transit is stopped. Right? I mentioned how the shift in Turkey's policies had tremendous consequences. In general, you want to make sure that people do not privatize war, that individuals are not allowed to go from one country to another to fight wars, and that's regardless of whether you agree with the cause or not, right? You want to kind of stop this behavior, and it's something that you want all governments to enforce their borders. Tracking terrorist fighters is incredibly resource intensive, and so even though I've argued that the threat is often less than people think, I believe that's in part because security services have been resourced. So if you're going to follow people, if you're going to monitor people, you need a lot of resources, and that needs to continue. One thing that's been a problem are the lack of off-ramps for individuals who are thinking of joining these groups. Often the response in both Europe and the United States in particular, and in some countries in the Arab world, has been a heavy reliance on law enforcement as a first resort. And what you often want are some mechanism for a mother to call a government and say, I'm worried about my son, and the choice for the mother should not be jail or her son going to Syria. There should be some form of intervention in between where we are able to take a person off this track. And the last thing I'll say is a lack of resilience, right? I think the U.S. track record in terms of terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland has been remarkably successful. Slightly over 100 Americans have died from jihadist-linked terrorism since 9/11. That's 100 too many. But that's far fewer than most of us, myself included, anticipated in the dark moments after 9/11, and we need to recognize that counterterrorism officials have been, in many ways, quite successful. However, we do see this resilience failure, and I see it with European countries in their refusal to handle their own nationals in places like Iraq and Syria, where it's a failure to accept any risk. It's a failure to understand that sometimes it's a dangerous world out there, and part of being a responsible government is grappling with that rather than pretending that others should bear the responsibility for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I guess Dan didn't receive my email in which I specifically forbid any form of optimism. So I hope now Matt Levitt will come back and scare everybody here.
Well, I love being yin to Dan's yang. Even as I agree with many of the things he said, I have a much more pessimistic outlook. I'm pessimistic over the numbers. I'm pessimistic over the ability to communicate in encrypted platforms. I'm pessimistic about the ability to travel, even with all of the advances that Gilles and others described earlier, tremendous advances. We still have people associated with Islamic State, Daesh, or others traveling on some disturbingly sophisticated false documents. But my biggest concern, as someone who started his career working counterterrorism in the FBI and then later was the desk for Intel at Treasury, my bigger concern is that for some of the biggest types of terrorist threats that we will be facing, that we are already facing, but that we will be facing in the near future, we are very likely to be denied some of the most powerful, what has been to date, the most powerful information intelligence collection platforms we've had to date. So I want to talk a little bit on the finance side. I want to talk about the issue of Islamic State financing organizationally for their foreign fighters. I want to talk about financing for them maybe when they get back to their countries or wherever else they go. I want to talk about financing for what we described as homegrown violent extremists, HVEs. That can include people who are frustrated travelers who tried to go and were stopped, or tried to go and were incompetent and unable. And we've had many cases of both. Or it could be people who are just inspired, either continued to be inspired by Al-Qaeda elements like Anwar al-Awlaki, or more recently the material that's produced by Daesh. So the first problem I think we have to recognize, and Colin touched on this in his introduction, is that the Islamic State is not defeated as a terrorist group. It's defeated as an army, and it has not run out of money. True, it's no longer got access to the massive resources it once had, but it doesn't need the massive resources it once had. Insurgency and terrorism is unfortunately extremely inexpensive. And that kind of money they have access to, and then some. So consider the United Nations reports that have come out over the past months documenting even before the successful battles in Mosul and Raqqa, for that matter, that we knew that member states had reported that in anticipation of defeat, the Islamic State had begun to move significant resources out of Syria and Iraq, elsewhere in the region and beyond, in part, at least, to finance people who would be fleeing and become foreign terrorist fighters. I should note here, by the way, that I don't only like referring to returning foreign terrorist fighters. I think we need to be thinking also about exiting foreign terrorist fighters. That is, not every foreign terrorist fighter is going to be returning to their country of origin or the country from whence they last came. Some will be exiting to other areas. So, for example, in my recent research, it's come to my attention that at least several dozen foreign terrorist fighters affiliated with Daesh from the former Soviet Union have apparently recently turned up in the Sinai. And there are some places, whether it's Sinai or Libya, Tunisia, the Sahel, Afghanistan, where we could see some near-term problems at a minimum. But if you follow reporting from other governments, the Australian government, for example, has talked about its concern about just this issue. According to one Australian report, and I quote, regional authorities are concerned by funds flowing into the region to support local terrorism networks, end quote. And then the report goes on to note that, again, given the small amount of funds that are required to stage a deadly attack, even small amounts of money from foreign terrorist groups pose a significant risk to the region's security. So it's worthwhile thinking about it in those terms too. They would only need to transfer relatively small amounts of money, which again become more difficult to track. But separate from and I should mention that we've even seen fairly large sum of monies be sent around the world for fairly large operations. The siege of Marawi, for example, we now know, involved a significant amount of money that was sent by ISIL Corps to people there to finance that operation. I do think we need to spend some time thinking about the financing of the returning and exiting foreign terrorist fighters, however. As we've said, the group has already moved monies outside of Syria and Iraq. Those funds can be sent in small amounts of money. They're difficult to trace through formal or informal systems. We need to be thinking here not only about whether or not terrorist groups, by the way, have access to money in the first place, but whether they have access to the ability to move those funds. And I submit that with some relative ease, they still do. And that's going to become much more difficult to track for the following reason. Traditionally, certainly when I started my career in counterterrorism at the FBI in the 1990s, there were three basic tools at our disposal, and if we used one or two or three of these, we were probably pretty good. And those were, if you could track someone's travel, if you could track someone's communications, and if you could track someone's financial flows in or out, you were pretty good. Well, nowadays, it's becoming much more difficult on all three of those counts. Certainly, if you think about homegrown violent extremists who aren't necessarily traveling anywhere, tracking their travel is not going to be helpful. There's a lot of reason to be hopeful for the reasons you've heard in earlier panels about some of the really tremendous biometric and other steps we've taken forward to facilitate our ability to get information from the battlefield to law enforcement. I downplay that not one little bit, but I hear reports over and over from Western European countries and others, in other words, countries with sophisticated immigration controls, about their concern that people continue in small numbers to be able to enter their borders through very sophisticated false documents. And that's something we have to be very concerned about. I should mention, by the way, it's not a new concern. It shouldn't be a new concern. Right after 9/11, the CIA produced a report, which has since been declassified, and so I can share part of it with you now, in which it documented its concerns about, quote, the expanding links between alien smugglers and extremists. And it noted how a variety of terrorist groups at the time, it was particularly concerned in this regard with Hamas, Lebanese Hezbollah, and Egyptian Islamic Jihad, that were using smuggling networks to facilitate terrorist travel. Maybe not the same groups, in some cases definitely the same groups. Hezbollah certainly does. But today I think we have to be no less concerned about that as well. Communications, we still are able to trace communications. There's still some very interesting and useful things we can do, and we can make tremendous use of social media that is not encrypted. But I'm here in Qatar, and I called my children this morning to wake them out of bed, because one of them in particular responds better to dad in the morning than to mom. And if I'm going to travel, that's the deal. You call and wake him up. And I called to wake him up, and I called on WhatsApp, not because I didn't want anybody to listen to me waking up my son, but because it was a stable, strong connection. And that presents some very significant problems. And if you talk to senior officials at the FBI and elsewhere, our concerns about, quote, going dark are very real. But I think what people pay insufficient attention to the most is on the issue of money. I think we have a real problem here. Because homegrown violent extremists or foreign terrorist fighters who return and are smart enough in terms of operational security not to remain in constant contact with other known operatives, because their operations require so little money, the type of activities that we usually did to spot that money or trace that money, follow that money, are largely going to be denied to us. We're not likely to see people receiving money from a foreign terrorist organization or sending to other individuals that we know. Think about what we learned when people were beginning to become terrorist travelers to go to Syria and Iraq in the first place. We saw cases in Canada where people said, I need a couple of $1,000s to buy my ticket and get there. I can go work in the shale oil industry where people take workers by the week. I can make a few $1,000s and go. That happened. We had a person in the United States who realized he was going to get a pretty good tax refund of a few $1,000s from the federal government for taxes he had prepaid, and realized I can just wait until I get my federal tax refund and I can use that. We had people who went into their regular bank accounts because we're not talking about a significant amount of money. We had people who went and raided their college fund or asked their parents for money without telling them what the money was going to be for. We're not going to see necessarily the same types of trends. And when they do need money that they can't get access to, they're finding ways to do that. So we're seeing quite a few people in Europe, for example, who abused welfare payments and used that money for terrorist purposes, travel or otherwise. And we see, as people have begun to recognize something that is not at all new, but some significant overlap between the crime and terror worlds, the crime-terror nexus. And again, this can be small-scale crime. Either people dipping into crime that they hadn't been engaged in before because they need a little bit of money, but much more frequently, we're seeing in Europe in particular, people who were small-scale criminals and have been radicalized to terrorism and continue to use their small-scale terrorist, that is to say criminal skills, to finance either their own terrorist travel, their own terrorist activities, or as we saw in several cases in Belgium and elsewhere, the terrorist travel of others. And so I'm very, very concerned about the inability to rely on the types of traditional information and intelligence platforms that we've used before to be able to get the kind of information we will need for tomorrow. But I'm also concerned not just about the primary threat that we think about when people say foreign terrorist fighters, we tend to be thinking on the Sunni side of the equation. And I think we need to recognize that in what has been, at least in part, a very sectarian conflict, there are at least as many fighters who are radicalized to a violent extremism from the Shia side of the equation. And a great many of them are foreign terrorist fighters as well. Maybe not from as far afield, many from Iraq, some from Lebanon, but we have from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, etc. I think we need to think about that. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, and as we think about the likelihood of this threat continuing, I think we need to recognize that the current foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon with Syria started before there was anything called Daesh. It started before there was anything called Nusra. It started because there was a guy named Bashar al-Assad who was using starvation as a tactic of war, who was barrel bombing his own people and was using chemical weapons against his own people. And it's critical that at a conference like this, we recognize that Bashar al-Assad has killed exponentially more people than the Islamic State. And as long as Assad remains in power, he will remain a magnet for the foreign fighters of the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your comments, Matt. Some really, really excellent points there, including something I want to touch on a little bit in Q&A, which is the small dollar terrorism phenomenon, or to use the term that Magnus Ranstorp used in his CTC Sentinel article, microfinancing the caliphate. And another excellent point on Shiite foreign terrorist fighters, which have the added benefit of having a state sponsor. Which is quite helpful, and then also your point on just the various ways in which people were able to raise money, including abusing welfare payments, and then some of the things that I've worked on as well were defaulting on loans, right? And someone said, well, I was once asked a question when testifying before Congress, why aren't these people concerned about their credit scores? And I almost did a double take of, well, when you're planning on, martyring yourself, I don't think you're really concerned about having bad credit. So thank you very much. I appreciate your remarks.
So it's been a really long day for all of you, and I'm the last speaker. And when I agreed to take the panel and got the question I'm supposed to address from Colin, it really relates to the last 10 and a half years of my experience at the Department of State, leading an office that's responsible for sending recommendations to the Secretary of State, essentially recommendations in this office from the time I've been in it to Secretary Rice to Secretary Pompeo related to the sanctioning of terrorists as foreign terrorist organizations, the sanctioning of individuals under an Executive Order 13224, and the sanctions of state sponsors of terrorism. And then Colin asked, what could I tell you about what worked and what didn't work? And I guess my question is, how much time do we have? Because there's a lot that still isn't working. But I will try to be as brief as possible because I am your last speaker. Before answering what's worked, I think it's important to take a step back in the context of terrorist designations, which is a bit esoteric of an issue, to fundamentally understand what's the purpose of a terrorist designation, and it's to prevent individuals from generally using the formal financial system, but to do other things as well, which I hope to share with you over the course of this conversation. But also take another step back. The reason why the State Department and the Treasury Department sanction terrorists stems from our national experience rooted in 9/11. Prior to 9/11, there really weren't significant terrorist designations being pursued by the U.S. Department of State, the Treasury Department. Those legal authorities barely existed or didn't exist at all. Information wasn't being shared between agencies, between intelligence community and policymakers, between intelligence agencies and law enforcement. And then the actual offices charged with looking at sanctions as a possible tool to use against terrorists and their access to finance was, to be kind, quite small. The State Department had a couple people, the Treasury Department had some people, but it wasn't a robust effort dedicated to really countering terrorist finance through the use of sanctions. But that all changed after 9/11, and the good story, I think, is, from my perspective, in terms of what does work, it's information sharing between these agencies and departments now in the context of developing terrorist designations packages for the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Treasury. Those packages can't be developed unless the State Department or Treasury Department have access to intelligence or credible open source information. And that access is flowing freely within the U.S. government system, and I think it's one of the great positive aspects of what's occurring post 9/11 in the context of sanctioning of terrorists. We also have done quite well in terms of staffing up the State Department and Treasury Departments and able to essentially have individuals who can review this information to put together these dossiers against individuals. So that's been positive. And of course, legal authorities now exist at the State Department and Treasury Department. Those are all things that are very positive. What else is positive? The State Department and Treasury Department sanction a whole lot of people, a lot of foreign terror fighters, individuals from Asia, individuals from Europe, women, men, people like Emily Koenig from France, Sally Jones from the UK. In doing that, you're essentially illustrating the scope of the threat. You're not always taking these individuals' money. That's part of it if you can do it, but it's also highlighting the threat these individuals pose. So in the context of what worked, I think the State Department and Treasury Department and the U.S. government did a good job highlighting the general threat posed by foreign terror fighters by the application of terrorist designations as a tool. What hasn't worked? So this is where I again ask, how much time do we have? The US government's really good about sharing information amongst themselves, but we're not really good at sharing information all the time. This is where I disagree with some of our earlier panelists with other governments. In the context of terrorist designations, we'll send out demarches worldwide asking governments here in this room to follow the US action as it relates to the sanction of a terrorist. But we don't always provide you additional information that you may need to be able to pursue those designations under your respective legal authorities. And one of my failings, I think, as director of the office was that we didn't share enough information with governments when we made those requests. And I hope that's something government officials in the United States consider doing more of, working with our intelligence community to do a better job of it. Second, when we receive requests from foreign governments to designate terrorists using US designations tools, we're not always very receptive to that. It may not fit with US government policy priorities. And in that sense, because the US system of designations is so slow, we've, I think, generated a lot of frustration amongst our partners in our inability to support those foreign government requests. And I look at that as a failing as well. And third, I would say that our sanctions regime, whether it's a foreign terrorist organization or a designation of an organization or individual pursuant to Executive Order 13224, is not always the most nimble. You may have an organization or an individual trying to come out from the cold to essentially reform, to no longer engage in terrorist activity, but I can't tell you how hard it is to remove that individual or that organization from the terrorist designation list once they're sanctioned. Our ability to essentially pivot, to essentially entice that individual to give up violence isn't necessarily as robust as it could be, and it doesn't act as quickly as it ought to be. So that's a failing. One of the most significant failings I look at relates to engagement with Silicon Valley. And I think this is more about conveying to foreign government partners about what's the right question to ask to Silicon Valley, particularly the social media entities like Twitter and Facebook. And I'll say that the right question to ask, the right way to engage with Facebook, or Twitter, or Google is to actually highlight the fact whether or not the US government has a designation on its book of the individual or organization you may be concerned about that is using social media, whether Facebook or Twitter. Because it's been my experience when the US has that engagement, generally speaking, Twitter and Facebook will say, well, okay, that's a US terrorist designation decision. That gives us the leverage we need to remove that content. So the one thing I wish I had done more of was to convey that message to our foreign partners to actually look at the State Department and Treasury Department's terrorist designations list so they could engage in a more efficient and effective manner with social media entities. And then lastly, one of the most significant failings I've seen over the last 6 years, essentially since the onset of the conflict in Syria, is the inability of the United Nations 1267 Committee, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS Sanctions Committee, to list ISIS affiliates at that sanctions committee. It's essentially a listing regime that does not have a number of groups that I think we would all agree as terrorists on that list. The ISIS Khorasan branch is not listed. The ISIS Libya branch is not listed at the 1267 committee. I can go on. Essentially 7 of the 8 branches, the formal branches, are not sanctioned at that committee. And that's a failing of the, not necessarily the UN, but the member states that comprised the Security Council. When we tried in the United States to nominate those branches for listing at the United Nations, we were rejected by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Russia for ostensibly political reasons. And pointing back to the Syrian conflict, or the perception that would exist if those entities were listed at the committee, that it would look poorly upon those governments because ISIS exists. Well, guess what, folks? ISIS does exist in those countries, whether or not they're listed at the UN 1267 committee. But the problem lies in the fact that because they're not listed at the committee, it is very difficult to essentially have multilateral cooperation in the most robust manner you can have because they're not listed. And I think we've talked a little bit about definitions of terrorism, and the UN has failed since the 1970s in defining the term terrorism, and will continue to fail because of political reasons. But one way I think that we can be successful in a multilateral context is by actually adding these individuals and groups to the UN 1267 list. because I think inherently by adding those groups or individuals, you are defining those individuals or organizations as terrorist threats. So in that sense, I would look at as a recommendation to pull together, hopefully in the post-Syria conflict, an ability to list those organizations or individuals, because those individuals and organizations that are affiliates of the ISIS core group are going to be the next great threat, and the individuals who comprise those organizations will be the next great threat. And you may not necessarily have the pretext, because those affiliates aren't listed at the UN, to list those individuals that may pose the next great threat to international peace and stability. And essentially, from my perspective, until that happens, I think we're not going to have a sufficient multilateral response in the context of using sanctions as a tool against ISIS foreign terror fighters or ISIS's affiliates. And as ISIS continues to erode from its core, as the core becomes weaker, it's going to continually rely on those affiliates. And the sinew, essentially, or the tissue between the core group and the affiliates, is an organization, a sub-organization of ISIS called the Immigration and Logistics Committee. And it's that committee that's going to provide for the core group essentially the ability to push goods or finance out to the affiliates. And those affiliates will continue to grow strong. So unless there is more effort dedicated to sanctioning individuals within the sub-core group within ISIS, the Immigration and Logistics Committee, there'll continue to be challenges as it relates to foreign terror fighters. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I mean, some real deep knowledge up here, represented by decades of combined experience working on these issues at a tactical and strategic level. So very, very informative, and I thank you all again. We do have the email address up here to take questions, so if you have questions, please send them. I'll receive them on the iPad. For now, I'll take moderator's preference because I've got a number of questions. I'll be somewhat parsimonious. But I'll start, and this one is really for anyone on the panel, but I think, General, you'd be well positioned to answer this. And that's, what can other countries in the Gulf learn from what Qatar has done in terms of not just passing laws to prevent the financing of terrorism, but in implementing and enforcing those laws?
I think what we look at it, I think every single country has its own system with its own, application to really have their own designation regime. I think what fits for Saudi Arabia does not fit for Qatar. What fits for the United States does not fit for Qatar. But I think, just as my respected panel said here, I think we have to look into this as of we're dealing with human beings here, and definitely we have, as the United Nations Security Council reflected. We have to consider, to attract these individuals back to the society, to confine them. There are certain people who really been alienated, but you would have to put them in an environment where you have to attract them. As you know, in the latest reports now, organized crime, drugs smugglers are really now got contacted with them on the prisons, and now these terrorists are using the network of all of this. So, what fits for Qatar, fits for Qatar. And I think every single country should really study thoroughly, their domestic designated regime to make it fit for their own selves.
It's a very fair point, the tailored approach. We do have a question on the iPad, and it's a question for Professor Byman. While I agree with you that CT efforts have delivered results when it comes to limiting the number of attacks, this doesn't sound like a question. Is there a RAND person in the audience? When it comes to limiting the number of attacks in the US and Europe, at the same time there are areas which were hitherto untouched, where we can see the specter of terrorist violence looming large. The Rohingya crisis, with its large diaspora, has potential to become a future hotspot. What should be the policy to prevent this from happening?
One thing we've already seen in propaganda is the Rohingya crisis, and it's of course not surprising that we've seen it more pronounced as we've gotten closer, to the conflict area itself. What we need to think about, I think, are multiple policies. One is, first of all, this is a humanitarian catastrophe, right? So simply on moral grounds, on humanitarian grounds, there should be pressure to stop the killing, and there should be support for taking care of the refugees who have been victims of tremendous violence. So that's something that should be done regardless of a terrorism threat. But what needs to be done consistently with refugee populations in general is a mixture of integration and providing services and sustained attention. Right? What I always worry about, frankly, just to broaden this question slightly, is what I worry about what might be happening in Germany right now, which is a very strong welcome in a very impressive way by Germans of refugees from around the world, but then a backlash that leads to very harsh treatment and leads to alienation that 5 years, 10 years down the road leads to a community that came in very happy with the government and all of a sudden feels very vulnerable and very threatened. And when we go to the Rohingya, the governments there, of course, have far fewer resources. So the responsibility is not simply on the host governments, but really on the international community. And one of my frustrations is that in the United States and in other countries, people have been turning their back towards the responsibility we have towards those who are fleeing persecution. And I think the Rohingya are a great case where we really need attention, and I worry about the long-term consequences.
If you don't mind, I'd like to just go back to your first question for a second.
Sure.
I think it has to be said at a panel like this. The elephant in the room is that there's a little bit of a conflict within the GCC, and that conflict is not necessarily conducive to the kind of joint counterterrorism efforts that we're discussing. There are some positive notes. At U.S. lead, we've created the Terror Finance Tracking Center, which is headquartered in Saudi Arabia, but really is a joint U.S. GCC effort, of which Qatar is very much a partner and a player. And Qatar, like other GCC countries, has joined in quite a few designations, including some that probably were not comfortable for Qatar, some Qatari citizens, and we're full partners in that. I've written before, and I'll say again, I would like to see the Terror Finance Tracking Center used as a way to bridge this conflict, which involves people pointing fingers at each other on the issue of terror finance in particular. And I think one way to do that would be for GCC member states affiliated with the Terror Finance Tracking Center to be nominating potential candidates for designation. Let this not just be a U.S.-driven effort that then GCC countries sign on to. I think that would show some significant buy-in with our GCC partners. You know, the U.S., I have to say, is investing significant resource to help our close allies across the GCC in capacity building to be able to do designations and do prosecutions and the type of things that we're seeing many of our GCC partners go forward with. So building on that capacity building, I think the Terror Finance Tracking Center is a real opportunity to try and help bridge one of the critical issues that seems to be at the heart of this GCC rift.
Of course, you know, the TFTC Center, which are being accomplished now in Riyadh, Qatar is part of it, and we are really now working on the governance issues of it, and definitely this is one of the very important pillars of that one. In addition to what Dr. said, Dr. Matthew, is that, we are all mandated by, world best practices and all these, whether, talking about the FATF, the IMF, and then, the United Nations Security Council resolutions, all these are drawing with a full system of every single country, who really giving the broad guidelines for every single country how to follow it. So therefore, if you really fall in within that gap, I think you'll be safe. But definitely, like we said previously, that, there is different things between, each domestic regulation and laws that definitely have to adhere with the international system. This is just I want to add.
So one of my questions is, we talk all the time about the threat potentially posed by virtual currencies, Bitcoin, the dark web, and how these technologies and emerging technologies could be used to fund and finance terrorist groups in the future. But we very rarely talk about the promise of technology, and as Dan pointed out in his opening talk, there is a lot of promise there on the CT side of the house. So I'm wondering, specifically related to terror finance, and more to the point of this small dollar terrorism, Are there promises out there with emerging technologies, big data solutions, and algorithms to get a handle on these kind of smaller dollar denominations, or some of the trends that we saw, particularly in Europe, where crime was financing terrorism, or terrorist-related logistics, trips to Turkey, the supplies necessary for foreign terrorist fighters? Is there something there? Where's the balance between the kind of dangers and some of the promises or advantages?
Look, I think there are more challenges than obvious opportunities here, but there are some real opportunities. In particular, I think that we need to think of this when we're thinking about the law enforcement and intelligence way to address this. We have to use, latest technologies and old school, tools as well. So like you said, tracking things to geographic locations that are of particular concern. We just need to be, putting all our data together. There is a tremendous opportunity that is already being used extensively in the ability to track IP addresses. So certainly when you engage in formal banking, including online banking, of course, if you make a transfer from your cell phone right now, that's all using IP addresses. You can sometimes use IP addresses for regular types of communication at a time and place when you know or suspect someone is engaging in financial activity, and track the IP addresses that way. What we're finding, though, is that tracking IP addresses is not as powerful when it's just within the public sector, and enhancing significantly our public-private cooperation is critical here. The FATF has written about this. U.S. government has been working on this. I think there's a lot that the U.S. and other countries could learn, for example, from the UK's Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, which is a public-private initiative. So there are some things that can and are already being used to help us track payments in a world in which everything is online.
We do have another question coming in on the iPad, and in the essence of time, this will probably be the last question that we take. And it concerns one of the things that we talked about earlier, which is the crime-terror nexus. And the question is along the lines of, with the connection between terrorism and organized crime, do we have evidence of such a relation? And, this is a topic that I've studied quite a bit in my own research, and we've seen what Phil Williams has called DIY organized crime, terrorist groups kind of building these capabilities in-house because of the inherent vulnerabilities of terrorist groups cooperating with criminal groups and vice versa. But just any thoughts that the panelists have on the crime-terror nexus? Is it overblown? And concerns about the future. Where do we see this kind of going as we move forward?
So it varies by group. And there are some groups that have some very significant transnational organized criminal connections. But when we're talking about Islamic State in particular, primarily we're not talking about organizational ties to large transnational organized criminal enterprises. What you're talking about are relationships of opportunity. What you're talking about are the radicalization of people, usually youth, who are already small-time criminals. And they're then going to leverage their small-time criminal, neighborhood criminal expertise for their view of the jihad in Syria or in Iraq. Think of the case in Belgium where one recruiter started going by the nickname Papa Noel because he told his recruits, look, you can continue doing whatever little crime you're doing. In fact, but you just need to give some of it to me so I can finance the travel of recruits to Syria and Iraq. And by the way, by doing that, that kind of gives religious cover and okay to the crime that you're doing because now you're doing it for the cause. So that's really more what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I remember your series of articles on Molenbeek. I think you were there right around the same time, and I've done a lot of work myself on Salah Abdul and some of the individuals related to the Paris November 2015 attacks. Thank you very much for really enriching and informative panel. We'll just have one more round of applause for our panelists up here.